What does assassination mean?
Well, it means somebody getting killed in a sort of surprise way.
That's what happened, you know. That man killed that other man.
A lot of people are sad and scared about it, you know.
I'd rather talk about it some other day.
Whenever you like.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible? It could. Is it possible, ladies and gentlemen? It is possible. He has. Not only Senator Kennedy. Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot. And another man, a Kennedy campaign manager, and possibly shot in the head. Right here, Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot.
A reporter for the Mutual Broadcasting System, Andy West, was in the hallway, the kitchen hallway in the Ambassador Hotel last night when Senator Kennedy was shot. He is perhaps the man who was closest to the senator when the shots were fired. Let's go back now to that hour last night. First, Senator Kennedy in victory, and then the voice of reporter West as our cameras show the panic that gripped the scene.
On June 5th, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California, Robert Kennedy was giving a victory speech. He had just won the California state primary. A Palestinian 24-year-old named Sirhan Sirhan assassinated him. Due to the fact that Kennedy was a strong supporter of Israel, Sirhan believed Kennedy's pro-Israel policies would lead to the downfall of Palestine. This incident left almost all of America traumatized and confused.
Mayor Yorty has just sent me a message that we've been here too long already. So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
Earlier that year, a monumental civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr., famous for his nonviolent approach to protest, was also assassinated on April 4th of 1968 by James Earl Ray, a white supremacist, during his stay at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
The Civil Rights Movement was a reactionary movement to the injustices of people of color, as well as a hope to bring an end to racism in America. Events such as the Montgomery bus boycott from December 5, 1955 to December 20, 1956, and the March on Washington protest on August 28, 1963, all stemmed from the same issue of racial injustice and inequality. While their objectives were peaceful protests, oftentimes other non-supporters, racists, and even law enforcement reacted with violence and brutality, even though the protesters had an absolute, unquestionable right to be there and were not breaking the law in any respects. Unfortunately, shortly after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death on April 4, 1968, the Civil Rights Movement was brought to a close. It lasted from 1955 to 1968. However, its positive impact on the world, as well as the hardships its members had to go through for a more equal and inclusive America, can still be felt today. During the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, which was also the first Spanish-speaking country in which the Olympics were held, gold and bronze medalists African Americans Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fisted gloves in the air, which represented support for the civil rights movement.
On January 15th of 1968, Janet Rankin, at age 87, led 5,000 women on a march in Washington, D.C., protesting the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Men also did their fair share of protesting. From 1940 to 1973, men were drafted from college into the Vietnam War to fill vacancies that could not be filled by voluntary means. There were many colleges across the country erupting with protests and anger to attempt to not end up in the Vietnam War. On February 8th, civil rights protests at South Carolina State turned deadly with 3 students being killed and 28 wounded. White officers fired into a crowd of 200 African American students demonstrating against segregation at local places. On March 16, 1968, an atrocity known as the My Lai Massacre occurred.
More than 500 slaughtered, including young girls who were raped and mutilated before being killed by U.S. officers. The U.S. covered it up for a year before the event being revealed to the public. It caused a firestorm of public outrage. The Tet Offensive also caused many Americans to doubt their country. The Tet Offensive lasted from January 31st, 1968 to September 23rd, 1968. During the Lunar New Year for Tet holiday, North Vietnamese and Communist forces launched a surprise attack against South Vietnam. The U.S. and South Vietnam sustained heavy casualties. Even though it resulted in a U.S. victory, it made the press and countless citizens believed the U.S. was losing and gave war to the anti-war movement. What led to the Vietnam War was the Cold War. On March 12, 1947, the Truman Doctrine was introduced as an American foreign policy, which stated purpose was to counter the Soviet Union and the expansion of communism.
This raised tension between both powers. On the 26th of July in 1953, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara led an attempt to overthrow Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. The rebellion would last until January 1st of 1959. America now had a communist regime set up right in their own backyard. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara became figures of rebellion, and they were quite popular with many college students in America. And on the 22nd of October 1962, John F. Kennedy announced that the Soviet Union had installed a missile base in Cuba, thus beginning the Cuban Missile Crisis. America now lived in fear because these Russian missiles were now in range to take out any city in America. November 1st of 1955 marked the start of the Vietnam War, and on March 8th of 1965, on order of President Lyndon B. Johnson, the USA joined South Vietnam in the fight against the Communist North. What followed is considered to be one of the most controversial decades in American history. On April 7, 1971, Richard Nixon announced the plan to withdraw 100,000 U.S. troops from South Vietnam.
Nixon won the 1968 on the promise that he would end the Vietnam War as soon as possible. Earlier in 1960, Richard Nixon ran for president against John F. Kennedy and lost. 2 years later, in 1962, Nixon ran for governor of California but lost to Pat Brown. But on November 5, 1968, Richard Nixon defeated Herbert Humphrey and George Wallace by a landslide. Then, on January 20, 1969, Richard Nixon was sworn in as the 37th President of the United States. Later, he was convicted but later pardoned for the Watergate scandal in which he was attempting to steal information from the Democratic National Committee headquarters in D.C. This conviction later caused him to resign from office with the ever-so-famous quote,
"I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
1968 was a year of chaos, confusion, and fighting, from 2 assassinations that shook the American people, to a landslide election that led to a corrupt president to try and hold a divided nation together. The year was spearheaded by a never-ending war in Vietnam that caused immense rage within America as well as the rest of the world. Students and groups of all different ethnicities protested and struggled for what each group believed in. Remnants of '68 can still be felt and seen to this day. And that's why 1968 will forever be one of the most controversial yet important years in not just American history, but global history as well.